mentioned, the event tonight is hosted by Power to Change. Power to Change desires to be a resource on campus to inspire students to explore the spiritual dimension of their lives. The purpose of this debate is to encourage students to consider various perspectives on the existence of God and to think critically about the implication of this topic in our lives. The moderators for tonight will be AJ Cormier and Sakshi Sharma. AJ is a fourth-year public affairs and policy management student here at Carleton. He is involved with the Carleton University Debate and Speech Club and recently represented Carleton at the World University Debate Championships in Berlin. Sakshi is the Vice President External for Carleton Debate, the same club that AJ is involved with. She's in second year of completing a double major in economics and global politics. In the selection of our speakers, we wanted to ensure we found experts in the field who could provide a credible defense of their respective points of view. The proposition to be debated tonight is God exists and we can know him. Representing the yes side of the argument, we have Dr. Kirk Durston. Dr. Durston has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Physics. He earned an MA in Philosophy at the University of Manitoba, where he specialized in the problem of evil. He has a Ph.D. in Biophysics from the University of Guelph, where he specialized in the identification, quantification, and application of functional information to protein structures. He has published in science journals and philosophy journals. He lives near Waterloo, Ontario with his wife Patty, and they have 6 children. He also enjoys wilderness, canoeing, and camping with his family and friends. Representing the no side of the argument is Dr. Geraldine Finn. Dr. Finn has a BA in English from Keele University in England, an MA in philosophy from McMaster University, and she also received her Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Ottawa. She is currently a professor of philosophy here at Carleton University. Her Ph.D. in philosophy from her area of expertise is 20th century continental philosophy and its relevance to contemporary interdisciplinary studies in politics, culture, and the arts. She has published widely on a variety of issues at the intersection of philosophy, feminism, musicology, and cultural studies, and is currently working on 3 major research projects: The Truth in Music and Songs of Philosophy, which seek to write by and for the ear that hears, rather than the seeing eye, and include sound recordings of what she calls musicae, philosophy musicae, and the third one, Interrogating the Category of Religion, which examines the political implications of the naturalization of religion as it is deployed in contemporary debates about the proper place of religion in culture and society. She is currently working on 2 book-length studies, Man, God, Religion, and The Truth in Music. We are very grateful to both of you to take the time to be here tonight. We look forward to a respectful debate and wish to inform everyone that the purpose of this debate tonight is to promote critical thought on the topic at hand and not to foster an environment of hostility and tension. We thank you for being respectful to those sharing each point of view at tonight's event. If you do have questions, there will be an opportunity later to have them addressed by the speakers. At this point, I would like to turn the program over to our moderators.
Without much further ado, because you're here to listen then on me, we're going to start with the opening statements from Dr. Durston. I advise you to prepare questions and comments received inside your booklets during the opening statements of these 2 speakers, and hand them to volunteers along the sides during your next speakers after this. Just as a note for anyone behind me, we will be putting up our hands when they reach the end of their speech. Don't clap absurdly, don't be rude. This is just to show them they're going over their time. But after 30 seconds, I give you some leverage to do what you wish. But I assure that won't be a problem. We've talked about the speakers, we all know that it's going to be a problem. But yes, I invite the first speaker, Dr. Durston, to begin.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Student Club Power to Change for sponsoring this event. I think it's an important one to talk about, and I also want to say that it's a pleasure for me to discuss these things with Dr. Geraldine Finn. Just by way of overview here, my opening argument or opening presentations has 3 parts to it. I want to look at the creation event. My first point is that the creation event logically entails a supernatural cause. Secondly, I suggest that we have actually experienced God. And third, I want to deal or begin to deal with an objection against the existence of God, and that is that this world is very unjust, and therefore there is no God. So let's begin with the first argument, the argument from the origin of nature itself. About a year ago, there was an article in the science journal New Scientist entitled "Why Physicists Can't Avoid a Creation Event," and they looked at the three major theories of how this universe came about: the multiverse, oscillating universe theory, and that this is a one-off event. And the consensus amongst the cosmologists appears to be that regardless, even if you go with a multiverse or some ultimate M-theory system that Hawking and Molodno propose, regardless, every one of those scenarios must have a creation event or a beginning point. And Stephen Hawking is quoted in that article stating a point of creation would be a place where science broke down. One would have to appeal to religion and the hand of God. Now, my understanding is that Stephen Hawking is an atheist. I think he's just making a statement here. I don't know if he actually goes along with the consensus amongst cosmologists or not. But I'm prepared to argue that regardless, any scenario has a beginning. Just before I continue, I want to refresh your memories on what a circular fallacy is. A circular fallacy occurs when you assume your conclusion in your opening premise. You assume the conclusion is true in your opening premise, and then you use that opening premise to prove that your conclusion is true. I think you can see the circularity there, but it has implications when it comes to the origin of nature. And I describe nature as whatever, as the entire space-time continuum, a multiverse, whatever theory you currently hold, all of physical reality, will call that nature. So the implication is we cannot assume the existence of natural processes in order to explain how natural processes came into existence. That would be a circular fallacy. So logic requires that the cause of nature must be supernatural. And what I would define that as is it's not natural. It's not bound by space-time, matter, and energy, nor by the laws of physics. And this is not a case of, well, maybe someday science will find the answer to this. No, science is founded on, amongst other things, logic and natural processes, and space-time, matter, and energy. If you have no nature, you have no science. And that's why Hawking says that a beginning to nature, to whatever physical reality there is, entails the hand of God. Whether he actually, believes that or not, I don't know. So here's my argument, summary. Number one, the cause of nature is either natural or supernatural. And I would argue that's a true dichotomy. Those are the only two options. It's either natural or it's not natural. There is no third option. Second proposition, logic requires that the cause of nature cannot be natural. That would be a circular fallacy. Therefore, the cause of nature is supernatural. This would be a modus tollens argument, a deductive argument. Some people will call it a deductive proof for the existence of the supernatural. So what I'm suggesting here, and I'm not going to prove anything tonight. My objective is to help stimulate you to think. What I'm suggesting here is that nature itself is founded on something much bigger out there that is not natural. So the obvious question that always comes up is, well, then what caused that supernatural cause of nature? Well, recall that space-time is a component of nature itself. It would be a circular fallacy to assume the existence of time in order to explain how time came into existence. So that entails that the cause of time itself must be timeless, that this supernatural whatever it is must be a timeless entity. Now, it's logically impossible for any timeless entity to have a cause. To ask the question, well, what caused X, if X is a timeless entity, is to assume there was a time when X did not exist, then something caused it, and now it exists. But recall, logic dictates that X must be timeless, that this supernatural aspect out there, this supernatural entity. So logic requires that the cause of nature must be supernatural, timeless, and uncaused. And I want to mention that one of the names of God, the primary name of God given throughout the Bible, for all generations, God says, is I am. And philosophers and theologians interpret this to mean that God is a timeless being. Past and the future and the present, there is no distinction. God is timeless. The second thing that I want to suggest here is that the extreme fine-tuning of the universe to support life suggests that this supernatural creator, whatever it is, has intent and purpose when the universe was brought into existence. That is, that the universe would be capable of supporting life. So what I'm suggesting here is that the supernatural creator of the universe has attributes of a mind that can have intent and purpose. This is my second argument here, and if I was doing this tonight to try and win the debate, I would not be presenting this second argument. Extremely difficult to defend, but my objective here is to perhaps stimulate you to think about some things from a different angle that perhaps you have not thought about before. And so here goes. Argument from personal experience, and here it is. It starts off fairly sedate with a syllogism. Proposition number one, if at least one person in history has actually experienced God, then God exists. And I'm using the term actually here in the philosophical sense in that it really has occurred. It's not dreamed that there is a God or dreamed they had an experience or believed they had an experience, but actually has experienced God. So if at least one person in history has actually experienced God, then God exists. And that's analytically true in virtue of what it means to actually experience something. Proposition number two, at least one person has actually experienced God. At least one person in history has. Now that's the controversial proposition. That will be the difficult one to defend. I'll give it a try in a minute or so here. But if that proposition was granted, if it is the case that there has been at least one person somewhere in history that actually experienced God, then it logically follows that God exists. You cannot actually experience a non-existent entity. My suggestion here tonight, and now we're getting into the hard part, everyone here tonight has experienced the call of God in at least three different ways. And that's a suggestion. I realize there'll be a number of people here who would resist that suggestion, but here we go. The call of nature. I would suggest that God calls humanity through nature. There is something about nature that produces a reverence and an awe in people unlike anything we've ever made, any human creation. And it's not just simply because it's massive, like, say, a galactic supercluster. It could be the russet hues on one single ripe pear hanging on a pear tree in the fall. It could be the song of a bird. It could be a snowflake landing on a branch. And suddenly you seem to sense something profoundly deep, at the depth of your own soul, perhaps, that stirs you in a way that you're just not quite sure why that is, why nature produces. I've observed, especially amongst those more highly committed environmentalists, often you will see a reverence there for nature, an awe, almost a worship of nature. I would suggest that the reason that is, in the Bible, God says the creation of the world, since that creation of the world, his invisible attributes, eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. And so there's actually, if what I'm saying is true, there's actually an aspect of the supernatural woven right into nature itself. And the awe and the reverence that we experience sometimes when we're looking at something in nature is actually a contact with the supernatural aspect of nature. Now, many people, I think, mistakenly attribute that to nature itself rather than the creator of nature. In the same way that a beautiful painting, some would be a mistake to revere the painting when in fact it says something about the artist who created it. That's all I'll say about that first call. It's just a suggestion. My second suggestion is that we have all experienced the call of God through the moral law. Now, our intelligence might argue, and I've sat through grad seminars on theories of ethics and so forth, our intelligence might argue that justice and goodness are just a social construct or some sort of evolutionary artifact. But our hearts often tell us, no, there's something much more to this. And it often speaks most powerfully when we witness an atrocity. When, say, a barbarian snatches a babe from her mother's arms and dashes that babe's brains out on a wall, we don't sit there and say, I don't think that person's corresponding or fitting in with our unwritten social contract here. Or my evolutionary construct, or from my evolutionary past, this doesn't resonate with that. No. There's something that we profound at that moment that we feel has been violated, and it's much, much bigger than just some social contract. It's enormous. It seems that a crime has been committed against something that transcends not just the individual, not just societies and civilizations, but humanity, perhaps even the galaxies. That there's this moral law out there that somehow it tells us how we ought to behave, not how we actually behave, but how we ought to. I was at the American Humanist Association website, and I was fascinated to see their motto, good without a God. And I am suggesting to you that this compulsion to think we should be good is actually a response to that moral law that's out there somewhere that transcends humanity. I'm suggesting to you is the call of God to reveal to humanity that maybe we're not perfect after all. When we look at the injustice that surrounds us in the world, maybe there is perfection, maybe beauty dwells somewhere. And my third argument, it's not really an argument, my third suggestion is, could it be that your deepest cravings are the call of God within you? And let me pause here. I've often talked to students and say, well, if God exists, why doesn't he put a big sign up on the moon, or turn it into green cheese or something really spectacular? But let's just think about this for a second. What would it be like if beauty itself walked into this room? How would beauty itself communicate with you? Some splashy billboard? Some fancy speech? I doubt it. I think that if beauty personified walked into this room, you would feel it at the very foundations of your being. It would speak to you in a very different way than in English or whatever your mother tongue happens to be. And the philosopher Alvin Planck has defined God as a maximally excellent being. That is, a being that is that degree of excellence beyond which it's not logically possible to be more excellent. In the Bible, it refers to God, it speaks of God as saying, every good thing given and every perfect gift comes from above. And when you think about that, you realize that if that's the case, if he is a maximally excellent being, then he is the origin of beauty itself. He is the origin of justice and purity. He's the origin of every good thing. Art, music, love, honor, all of these things. And if such a being were to try and communicate with us, how would such a being do it? That's why I'm making these three suggestions here. Finally, could it be your deepest cravings are the call of God? We seem to have a deep craving for identity. That is the desire to be known and remembered, not just for our life, but hopefully for a little while afterwards, maybe even, well, it probably seems impossible, but forever. What about significance? We seem to have a deep craving to not be just a bag of meat sitting in the chair there tonight, but that somehow we have value that's independent of our body, of our financial wealth, of our academic performance, that there's something about us, our very soul, that is loved and honored and valued, and we would love to be loved, honored, and valued forever. And we have these cravings within us, but yet no human can satisfy that. But what if there is a being who is the origin of love and honor and beauty, and will remember you forever? And what if such a being has chosen to speak to us by instilling these deepest cravings within us? There's a fourth suggestion I want to make. I call it the personal call, when God actually speaks to the person's soul personally. Some of you here tonight may perhaps experience a personal call. It would be described as perhaps a deep, unsettling disturbance within your soul, perhaps a dawning realization that maybe that just might be true. Maybe it's true. It's disturbing to you. I want to offer myself as one person who has experienced God. So remember that three-step argument. If at least one person in history has actually experienced God, then God exists. At least one person has, therefore God exists. I'm going to make a claim that I've actually experienced God. My first experience of God was in nature. I stepped out one night, and it just seemed the presence of God spanned the horizon. He seemed to be infinite, yet infinitely far away from me. Went back into the house and tried to forget about what I had just experienced. And later it was explained to me, and I'll describe it this way. What if God is both the origin of flawless justice and perfect love? That creates a problem, because both flawless justice has to be satisfied as well as perfect love. But what if God himself became a human being, satisfied the demands of perfect justice so that he could then satisfy the demands of perfect love? And what if his name was Jesus of Nazareth? So as this was explained to me, and I was asked if I would like to make, what I want to do about it, and I says nothing, I wasn't ready. But there was a point after thinking a lot about this that I decided, okay, I'm going to put my faith in Jesus as who he claimed he is. The one who satisfied the demands of justice and perfect love, can give us eternal life. We can actually have a relationship with the one who is the origin of beauty itself, and honor and justice and love and every good thing given. I would have to say that the most fulfilling thing I've ever experienced in this life is the presence of God, which I often experience throughout the day. So that leaves you with a choice. I'm either insane, or I'm telling a whopper, as in a lie, or I'm telling the truth. And I'll have to leave it up to your good judgment, which one you'll check. I just want to close with looking at an objection that's often raised, that this world is unjust. I think I spelled that wrong. No. Actually, this is a quote, so he must have spelled it wrong. Either that, there's two ways of spelling it. Anyways, C.S., he can't have spelled that wrong. He was a professor of English literature, both Oxford and Cambridge, so I must be wrong. I get this from Mere Christianity. He was an atheist in the earlier part of his life, and his primary argument against God was that the universe seemed to be cruel and unjust. But what bothered him was how he'd gotten the idea of just and unjust. He wrote, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? His point seems to be this: one cannot speak about a high crime rate if there are no laws in existence to be broken. In the same way, one cannot argue that this world is not perfectly just if there is no objective standard of perfect justice that is being violated. So what is that perfect standard? So the argument from evil, the very first step we have to take is, well, how do we know what's right and wrong? Is it just an evolutionary construct, in which case, the moment I realize that, I feel no more constraints to abide by it if it's useful for me not to? Is it just a social contract and so forth? So in conclusion, in summary, I'm arguing that the origin of nature itself, the origin of space-time, matter, and energy, the M-theory, ultimate M-theory system, if there is one, whatever it is, had a creation event. That seems to be the consensus amongst cosmologists. But what I'm arguing here is that if nature had a beginning, it's logically impossible for nature to have brought itself into existence. That's a circular fallacy. There has to be something else that's not natural or supernatural. There's something out there not bounded by space-time, the laws of physics. And that something has intent in order to design this universe to be capable of supporting life. The second thing I suggested here is that all of us actually experience God at different points in our life. At least we experience the call of God through nature, through our own sensitivity to this moral law that seems to tell us how we ought to behave, that seems to transcend humanity. And third, the problem of imperfect justice requires an objective standard of perfect justice. And with that, I'll just leave the rest of it up to you to contemplate.
Thank Dr. Durston, and we'll correct myself from earlier. When you have your questions, they will end up being passed to the middle aisle behind the moderators to be delivered to us for the question and answer period. But again, moving on, we will now hear Dr. Finn's 20-minute opening address period.
I'm not sure that this is going to work, but can you hear me at the back? Yes, you can? It's partly because I have to read a text. Thanks. Okay, I was very pleased to offer myself for this debate because I think it's time that we heard from different kinds of atheists than the ones who tend to dominate the mainstream media and the public debates about God and religion. So what I'm going to present to you today is my kind of atheism. I will not be rehearsing any of the traditional arguments for or against the existence of God that you may have encountered in philosophy or theology, some of which were edged upon in the previous talk. This is in part because I think if you are already someone who believes in God, the arguments, powerful though they may be, against the existence of God will just roll off you, they won't have any effect. And if you are somebody like myself who does not believe in the existence of God, the arguments, powerful though they may be, for the existence of God will not have any effect. But there may be people who sit on the fence for whom these arguments may make some difference, and we may come back to them later on. Nor will I be presenting the familiar arguments of what are sometimes called the new atheists, who I've just referenced, who stage their opposition to God and the religions that speak and act in God's name with reference to the authority and achievements of reason or progress or science. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris in particular, and who routinely characterize what Christopher Hitchens once called the rantings of the godly, with various degrees of denigration, condescension, name-calling, and dismissal. I believe that this kind of atheism in many respects misses the whole point of the godly and fails to interrogate, examine, or engage the staying power of theism and religion and the traces of theism and religion in their own would-be scientific practical wisdom, which is indisputably godless. I believe they set up a false dichotomy between God and mammon, or science and religion, which conceals and therefore ignores what theism and this kind of atheism, I will call it scientific atheism, have in common. And this is what I want to talk about today. This is not in order to take a side in this particular debate, to argue in favor of one or the other, to reconcile them, or to calibrate their respective rights and wrongs, but rather to shift the focus and hopefully the ground of the debate between theism and atheism by identifying what makes for the unity of the field upon which these spokesmen of theism and scientific atheism do battle with each other, the contested terrain to which my kind of atheism is opposed. So my objection to both theism and what I'm calling scientific atheism is fundamentally an ethical and political critique, as much as it is an epistemological one. It's ethical and not religious and not scientific and doesn't depend on the law. I want to make a disclaimer here. I'm not claiming to represent anyone else but myself here or speak for any other atheists. So this is my kind of atheism. I begin with a definition of theism, which is taken from the Oxford English Dictionary. Theism: belief in existence of gods or a god, especially a god supernaturally revealed to man, and sustaining a personal relationship to his creatures. Now this seems a pretty non-controversial definition, accurately reflected in the question we've been asked to debate tonight, which is God exists and we can know him, as well perhaps as in the presentation by the first speaker. That is, with one or two apparently minor, but for me significant and disturbing differences. First, that in the question we were asked to debate, God exists and we can know him, the belief that featured in the Oxford English Dictionary definition has been transformed, raised, you may say, or reduced to knowledge, which is a very different creature and raises the stakes of the argument. Also, two, the singular subject of God's revelation to man, which is ambivalently generic or particular, which features in the Oxford English Dictionary definition, in the question we've been asked to debate, has become an anonymous collective we. Some of the implications of these changes should become clear as I continue. So what concerns me about both the dictionary definition of theism and the theism posited in this debate question is their consistent, explicit, exclusive, and I submit constitutive androcentricity. It is a theism, whether of knowledge or belief, that posits a God that on the one hand is revealed exclusively to man, that is, men, not woman. Man, the traditional representatives, authorities, interpreters, and agents of this God's will, law, demands. They are always men. And likewise, the principal disputants in the current debates about theism and its place in contemporary society. The second thing is that this God that is revealed exclusively to man is revealed exclusively as man, not woman, always and only referred to in the masculine as male and by way of the masculine pronoun, and most essentially as the father, origin, and creator, begetter of all things. An exclusivity of man to man, which, I suggest, is constitutive of and institutionalized in the great theisms, the traditional monotheisms, squabbling for ascendancy today, which I suspect has at least in part, if not in whole, motivated a debate like this. This is the theism that I reject. I want no part of it. Let us call it patriarchal theism, or perhaps more accurately, theistic patriarchy. For this presumption of patriarchal privilege, priority, and power is pervasive and not restricted to theism. It did not disappear with secularization or the ascendancy of the authority of science. Indeed, it is simply reproduced within it. Nor did it die with the death of God, but on the contrary is alive and well and living in a neighborhood near you. Let me list then some of the principal features of theism and what I'm calling scientific atheism that opposes it, which makes for the unity of the field, the contested terrain, over and upon which they are embattled, and which my kind of theism rejects, for reasons which are at once both epistemological and ethical. And then following this, a list of some of the principal exclusions out of which I believe that common ground is constructed. Caveat again, what I have to say now is necessarily schematic. It is just the bare bones of work I have developed elsewhere in much greater detail and in a much more nuanced way, or that I'm in the process of developing the future. So the first thing is, what makes for the unity of the field upon which the theists and the scientific atheists are embattled? The first point I want to make is their shared interest in, desire and demand for, and aspiration to a certainty which is absolute and totalizing, which leaves no room for difference or doubt, and is therefore deaf and indifferent to the discourse of the other, indeed, often to each other. An other which is either vilified or pathologized. Remember, says Hitchens, we are examining the childhood of our species. The second thing I believe they have in common is a corresponding assumption of and insistence upon the logic of identity, the oppositional logic of the excluded middle of either or, some of which we actually heard in the first speech. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists, George Bush. You either stand with us or you're with the child pornographers, Vic Choose. This is essentially a genocidal logic of the one, a monotonotheism, as Nietzsche once called it, of God, good, man, reason, right, reality, truth, beauty, justice, etc., which is always dichotomous and exclusive of another, which must be either assimilated or eliminated, reduced to the same by conversion, disavowal, or denial, normalized, or simply expelled. The third point of convergence that constitutes the common field of these theism, scientific atheism, is their joint reliance on the authority of esoteric knowledge and sacred texts, obviously Bible and scriptures in the religious field, the language of genes, stimulations of the brain, remote calculations by powerful computers, amongst the science. So what they rely on is the authority of esoteric knowledge and sacred texts. the origin, legitimation, and interpretation of which is presided over by a scriptural elite, which is exclusively, and when challenged, aggressively male, an institutionalized and state-sanctioned clerisy of university and church. The fourth thing that they have in common is the presumption of a teleological and linear history, of origins and ends, of reason, man, science, nature, the universe, whatever. Of soteriology, eschatology, and theodicy, which offers some determinate purpose, solution, or salvation to the complexity and contingency of human existence. A providential history with or without a God, in this life or in the next. Natural selection, reproductive success, progress, heaven, unity with the infinite, etc. And this in turn legitimizes, naturalizes the status quo. It justifies its evils, rationalizes its inequalities of suffering and power, and guarantees the meaningfulness and inevitability of it all. Fifth point they have in common is a corresponding assumption of an essence of human being, which is secured by God or by biology, and which provides the ontological guarantee of what I have said above. The demand or the affirmation of certainty, the logic of identity, one or other, the authority of sacred texts, a providential history of predetermined origins, means, and ends. The sixth thing they have in common, arising from the previous five, is a tendency to dogmatism, the intolerance of doubt, difference, confusion, or contestation, which is often seen as tantamount to apostasy and heresy, and subject to forms of excommunication, ridicule, rejection, negation. The negation which is inherent in the propositional form, the logic of either or, that their respective knowledge claims are made in. And finally, the seventh point, a result of all this, I think, is an abdication of personal responsibility for what is claimed to be true or done in its name, in the name of God, reason, progress, or science. For the dogmatic assertion of a determinate objective human essence, a pre-established harmony of means and ends, whether by natural selection or by God's will, effectively denies human agency, and therefore the responsibility with respect to both the thought and especially towards the action and the ends, displacing it from the individual and the community onto some impersonal, immanent, or transcendent power. The chemistry of the brain, your DNA, the will of God, the Big Bang, including the agency and responsibility of the spokesmen of theism and scientific atheism themselves, who present themselves as the messengers and purveyors, the evangelicals, if you would, of impersonal, objective truths, rather than their propagators, creators, and guarantors. So that's so much for the unity of the field, over and upon which I believe the spokesmen of theism and scientific atheism battle with each other. Now I'll say a few words about the warring parties, about what the warring parties agree to exclude together, the shared exclusions out of which the unity of the contested field is constructed. Again, I can only present the bare bones of a series of points that I have developed in detail elsewhere, and which are particularly difficult to summarize precisely because they are the structurally and systematically excluded of the traditional, authoritative, and institutionalized discourses of theism and science. But I will attempt to do this here by way of two principal organizing and overlapping themes. First, the theme of contingency, and second, what I call the space between. By contingency, I'm referring to the facts and the effects of birth, death, and nurture, of history, particularity, vulnerability, finitude, uncertainty, chance, and choice. And of course, I'm referring to the difference that sexual difference makes, to the truth of human origins in the bodies of women, not men, and the origin of their truths in the la-la-la of the mother tongue, and not the learned discourse of the father, which it, the father's discourse, at once assumes, appropriates, discredits, and disavows, together with what I call the space between. The space between is another way of characterizing a series of exclusions out of which the unity of the contested field of theism and scientific atheism is constituted. The space between is the irreducible, always shifting and dynamic space between experience and expression, between reality and representation, between existence and essence. It is the space of becoming, not being. It is the space in which we live, and is always in excess of, beyond and between the abstract categories of discursive thought within which we seek to name, frame, and contain it. Experiences are personal and particular, singular and unique, chaotic, contingent, and concrete. They are bound to specific people, places, practices, and times, and they do not come with their meanings attached. Meanings which are in turn dependent on local and historical specificities of language, culture, and tradition. Categories, on the other hand, are the product of systematic and collective reflection. They are abstracted from experience, and sometimes they are abstracted from abstractions, authorized by a scriptural and heretofore exclusively male elite, and returned to experience to provide the order, stability, continuity, and right thinking which will secure the interests of established or emerging social powers. We do not experience the categories of experience. We inherit them, or we make them up, and we apply them, or we have them imposed upon us. This space between experience and the categories, and the excess of one vis-à-vis the other, is, I believe, the ethical space. It is the space of not knowing, within which decisions as to what to think and how to act cannot not be made. I put it to you that the unity of the field, upon and over which the spokesmen of theism and scientific atheism battle each other, is constituted precisely by the exclusion, disavowal, discrediting, and obfuscation of this space between. I sometimes think of it as a flight from the flesh, and thus and thereby their collective abdication of the ethical responsibility for what is said and done in their name. To borrow the words of Vine Dolera Jr., speaking in another context, that is, as a Native American Indian with reference to Marxism, the theists and the scientific atheists are just another group of cowboys riding around the same old rock. Perhaps I will be able to say more about this later. I hope at least that I've given you something to think about. Thank you.
Okay, that was a fascinating presentation by Dr. Finn. Raised some very interesting and complex issues that I don't see normally raised in a debate here. I mean, not necessarily here, but in most discussions like this. Intriguing. I have 10 minutes maybe to raise some responses, or I just actually had a series of questions that perhaps could be dealt with maybe when some of them, when Dr. Finn takes the mic again. One of the things that Dr. Finn has pointed out is that, or she rejects, I think, is this idea that theism revealed exclusively to men, for men, and a patriarchal hierarchy in religious traditions, and so on and so forth. What if there is a difference between tradition that humans have spawned and the real thing? That's my question. You see, when you look at the planet here today, we are polluting and pillaging it. It's not as beautiful as it once was. But it's not beautiful, not because of any fault of the planet itself. It's beautiful. It's lost a lot of its beauty because of what humanity has done to it. What if that is the same thing? What if that same thing is occurring to spiritual reality? Humans have their problems. We know we're not living the way we ought to. One of the problems we have is personal pride, the quest for power, for example. And people will try and use anything they can to give themselves that power, whether it's to exploit a particular resource, whether it's to exploit a particular aspect of the spiritual realm for their own ends, for their own exaltation, and so on and so forth. So what I'm suggesting here is that we contemplate the possibility that there's a difference between tradition and, I say in the general sense, the tradition of what humanity has done to the spiritual reality and the real thing. That spiritual truth is defined not by what some human says somewhere, but it corresponds to a spiritual reality out there. And that's my first suggestion or first response, that I think that we need to deal with that further. Because I'm not a big fan of tradition in general. There are some traditions, like we do something for Christmas. We always buy a jigsaw puzzle for Christmas, you know. I think that's kind of harmless, but moving on. It has to do a little bit with this first question, but what if God is not like that? What if, as I was listening to the description of theism here, it struck me that a lot of this description has to do with what people have done to theism, but what I'm concerned about is what has God done. And I think that's why in my second argument, I like to suggest to you that God is calling you in a very, very different way, and it's a personal way, utterly independent of your gender. He speaks to us personally in ways that are too deep to actually sometimes articulate. This is the first time I've presented this kind of approach tonight, these three suggested calls of God. And I just felt like I'm a Stone Age tribesman climbing into the cockpit of a F-22 and trying to fly it. It's such a complex thing, these calls of God. The call from nature and the moral law, justice, and so forth. It was suggested that beauty, justice are always dichotomous, and I would concur that you will see many, many examples of how humans try and make them dichotomous, but what if there is a gradient here? What if some things are beautiful, but other things are even more beautiful, and some things are more beautiful still, and if you follow that trail, you begin to come to the convergence of beauty and justice and love and honor, and you find that it is a being that's absolutely indescribable. This is who I talk about when I'm talking about one who is from whom every good thing is given and every perfect gift comes. We tend to try and speak of these things in English or whatever our mother tongue is, but really the way that God would have to communicate with us is through our souls, and it's hard to put those things into words. Some things that I think Dr. Finn finds are troubling is the humans' propensity for wanting certainty and dogmatism. I would concede that humans do things like that. We want certainty, we want dogmatism. At least if you want power, you want to be dogmatic about it. But what if that's not at all what God is about? God, if He is who I have even just begun to describe, a timeless being, not bounded by the laws of physics, one who is a maximally excellent mind, who is the origin of beauty and truth. It might be better to think of God in terms of beauty and love and justice, personified, all rolled into one being. That might be the better way to think of God. And how could we possibly be certain when we talk about such a being? Unless we're going to define, and I suppose there are some things I'm certain about if I'm going to choose to believe in God, and that is He is a maximally excellent being, this God. And I should respond to the use of the masculine pronoun here. I think most Christian theologians would regard the idea that God has gender as absurd. I think it's better to think, perhaps one of the first thought-provoking statements we run across in the Bible when it says, and God created man, in His image He created them. By the way, man in Hebrew is a generic term to both male and female, and in case we missed the point, He says, in the image of God He created them, both male and female He created them. So there is something about the male that is missing and something about the female. You put the two of them together and you have what God says, this is good. But both the man and the woman are created in the image and the likeness of God. We're not necessarily talking physical here. I tend to see the image as more triune being, that we have a soul, a body, and a spirit. We can appreciate beauty and justice. And we have free agency to make moral decisions meaningful. We can sense God and so forth. But to speak of God, so I want to just set that right aside here. We're not talking about a God who has male genitalia or is male in any sense of the normal word, but one who both the male and the female are created in the image of. So that puts everything in a whole new perspective. What if God speaks to both equally? So I just want to set that aspect of things aside. I want to reject this idea that we can be certain about anything, or we can be certain about some things. I'm going to say I am certain that God exists because of my own experience of God. I've personally experienced God. Same as I've experienced my wife. And you might be able to come up with a brilliant argument why my wife doesn't exist. And all sorts of traditional horrible things about wives and so forth to convince me that the concept of wives need to be rejected and so on and so forth, and my wife does not exist. And I might be absolutely powerless to respond. I might say, that is so brilliant, I'm not even sure how to even begin my response. Nevertheless, I would know my wife still exists because I have personally experienced her. And this is what I'm suggesting about God, is that you can actually personally experience God. It doesn't matter what your gender is, your ethnic background, anything like that. And be very wary about anybody who says, I always tell people when I'm teaching them from a passage in the Bible, I say, don't trust a word I say. You check these things out personally to see if they're true. God has given us, each individual, that moral responsibility so that on Judgment Day, He says, your own thoughts and conscience will testify for or against you. Not God's moral law, not some religious figure. It'll be your own thoughts and conscience. That's all there is when you stand before God someday. So the question is, how are you handling the call of God, if that is the call of God within you? Your own thoughts and conscience will. I like this idea of space of becoming. That's an interesting idea. I think I'd like to hear Dr. Finn expand on that, because I don't know for sure what she means by that, but I tend to like it because that's the way I see my life. It's not a dichotomy that once I put my faith in Jesus Christ that suddenly I became perfect. No, I started at zero. And my entire life is becoming more and more perhaps aware of the presence of God with me and how He works within me. Same with my wife. My wife and I sit and we laugh at each other on the day we were married. We've been married 32 years now. I just laugh and I say, I had no idea who you were when I married you. In fact, I thought I did. I knew her quite well, I thought, but 32 years later, I know her much, much better. And that's what I'm suggesting here is this. My idea of the space of becoming is a process of knowing God.
I'd like to thank Dr. Durston again and invite Dr. Finn to give her 10-minute address in response to Dr. Durston.
Well, I must confess I don't know where to begin. Begin by bringing the mic down a bit. Okay. I'm tempted to at least identify one moment in our respective talks of convergence. We didn't use the same language about it, and perhaps we don't really converge on this. But Dr. Durston, he identified 4 personal experiences that he wanted to present as, I don't know if evidence is the right word, but reasons for your belief in God, or part of an argument, I guess. And the one, you made an appeal to the call to to the moral law or call of the moral law. I'm not quite sure. It could be both. You talked about witnessing an atrocity. I didn't like your traditional example of the barbarian grabbing the baby. It's such a hackneyed one. But when we witness an atrocity, you say that there's some kind of spontaneous call to the moral law. And you identify this as transcending the individual. And you said that you don't think it's an evolutionary construct, and it's not a social contract. It's not. It's something over and above those things. There's a certain kind of almost intuitive sense of moral outrage in the face of certain atrocities. I might agree with you there. I certainly agree with you in rejecting the appeals to some evolutionary science to account for our moral sensibility. And I do think that the theory of social construct theory doesn't do an adequate job at all. And I actually think that you talked about morality and I talked about ethics. But I do think that one thing that identifies that sense of moral outrage is that you are not necessarily, is that you are recognizing a value that in some way you haven't made up or made up your mind to accept, and that is not necessarily in your own personal interest and all that stuff. But I'm having difficulty knowing what to latch onto here. Because I think that to some extent you convinced me that you personally were not dogmatic. And perhaps the theism that you espoused would not reveal itself in this dogmatic way. Nevertheless, I was certainly not convinced by your effort to deal with the gender thing. It is just not true that most Christian theologians would not ascribe a gender to God. It is just not true. And if they don't ascribe a gender to God, why do they constantly refer to God as he and always in the masculine pronoun? Why do they not make an effort to undo those centuries of exclusive appropriation of God's word by men, for men, who are then empowered to pass it on to the women they feel are fit to hear it? Contemporary theologians continue to talk about man as if it were the norm and measure of some generic human being. And when they talk about man, they talk about him in terms of reference that apply to the lives of men. No theologian I know, but I could definitely be wrong about this. In fact, I think I know I am. I think there are feminist theologians who do this. But no theologians I know take their point of departure for thinking about human existence and the spirit, if that's what they want to talk about, from what I call the truth of origins, by genuinely considering where each one of us begins our life and how we begin our life and how we get our life and what enables us to have a life, and whose personal blood and milk and flesh and bones and effort enables us to continue to live. The Creator is still talked about as He. The Almighty Father is the one everybody wants to look up to. And even though, you did want to suggest that God can reveal Himself equally to men and women, you nevertheless continue to talk about Him as a He. It's very difficult to break that habit. And I think if people broke that habit, we'd have a very different picture of what this God might be. And it may not be quite such an attractive God. May not be able to prop it up in such a position of absolute authority that this God, the traditional God, has routinely been positioned there. I think your references to things like flawless justice and perfect love and beauty itself and the desire to be known and remembered forever and to have value independent of our body forever, and we have these cravings. I think these are illustrations of what I refer to as the logic of one. Because who is this we on behalf of whom you presume to speak? I don't think have a craving to live forever. I don't have a craving for absolute love and some of these other things that you mentioned. I have a craving for this kind of power that you mentioned. And if I do have a craving for some kind of power and I do have a craving for some kind of love, I think my craving is going to be significantly different from everybody else's craving and their craving. But to sort of make these, again, it's a kind of essentializing of human being. There were a couple of logical moves you made there, but I tend to think that these logical arguments are a little bit trite, although they can be quite convincing. It's kind of interesting, your very first one, you know, that well, you voice it in terms of a cause, and of course you posit a nature. So to take everything I put into question, you take it for granted that there is a nature. We all know what it is. It functions by some series of causal relationships. And so this, I mean, in as much as I know what nature is, I can see how everything begins. There's a sort of continuity of beginnings. I know where I came from. I know where my mum and dad came from. We can watch where puppies come from. We can see how the egg trees grow. Good, I'm glad I've only got 2 minutes. It seems so. So this is a very tricky argument. First, in that it, you know, so it says that nature cannot be the cause of itself. This is sort of reminiscent of, I think it's could be an Aristotelian argument or a Thomas Aquinas argument, which is that for the cause of an effect, the cause of an effect has to be greater than the effect. That which is the cause has to be greater than the effect. It has to include in itself the effect of which it is the cause, and it has to be greater than the effect. And I see this as a version of that. I don't really see why nature can't have a natural, well, you say nature is itself already an abstract category, so I'll talk about natural things. The natural world, it could be planets, could be bees, could be ants, could be wood, could be, and I mean, I think if you want to do a causal investigation, you can see where it all comes from. You can see where it all comes from. You can see where it all comes from. I don't see why you have to have an appeal to the supernatural other than this desire and demand for some absolute beginning. I don't understand why people want to know the origin of the universe. I have no idea why this is a compelling question. I don't understand why people think that you can't have an infinite regress. Why can't you have an infinite regress? One thing comes from another, comes from another, comes from another. It's mysterious, it's awe-inspiring. There's no logical necessity to have a starting point, to have this creative moment that then is supplied in your argument, and the guy whose name you invoked, I've forgotten for the moment. Goody, I've got 5 minutes left or I'm done. Good. But it needs this creative event that is supernatural or spiritual. So those are a few comments. Sorry.
So we're going to move on to questions. I'm going to start with a question directed to Dr. Kirk, and then we'll go back and forth. So, for Dr. Kirk, what is the definition of God? What makes a someone or something God?
What is the definition of God? In philosophy, the term God is generally understood to mean a being who is all-powerful, perfectly good, and all-knowing. That's the standard philosophical definition. Under perfectly good, some philosophers have expanded that to include the idea, or to clarify that idea of perfect goodness, as like Alvin Plantinga did, as maximally excellent, that degree of excellence beyond which it is not logically possible to be more excellent. So that would be the standard definition of God, at least those first three attributes. And then I went on to say there are implications if God is maximally excellent. That means he is the origin of beauty, justice, love, music, art, every good thing given and every perfect gift. And when you begin to think of God that way, you hopefully you might realize that the picture you had in your mind of God, maybe a man in a white beard sitting on a cloud somewhere, just might be a little simplistic. That God is massively more complex. But God is knowable if God is in fact calling us through these ways that I suggested tonight.
Dr. Finn to give a 1-minute response.
Oh, to that question?
Yeah. Or to
Good.
the
Yeah. Yeah, I like that question. One of the things that disturbs me about this positing of a God that is all things great and good and excellent is that it expropriates all the good things in human life, all the good possibilities that human beings aspire to and practice, all the things you've mentioned, creativity, beauty, love, intellectual brilliance, whatever, aspiration to excellence and goodness. These things occur in people's lives. And I think that by focusing all this greatness outside the human realm into some imagined transcendent being that some people feel they have experienced is to deprive ordinary everyday life of human beings. That's the end of it? Okay. Of the resources that are there.
Just a quick reminder, if you go over, feel free to wrap up.
No, there's always too much.
The way the format will work is the person who the question is directed to will get 2 minutes, and the person who's not will get 1 minute of response. So this question is for Dr. Finn in response to the kind of feminist argument that you made. Does the patriarchal nature of the Bible necessitate its inaccessibility to women and therefore society? And what if God has no gender?
What if God
has no gender?
I'll answer the last part first. If God has no gender, we better stop speaking about God as a him and attributing to him things like fatherhood, right? Things like giving life. So if God has no gender, then there's a lot of hard work for those theologians to do. Now, the first part of the question was, does this make the Bible inaccessible to women?
Or God in general.
Oh, pardon?
Or God in general.
Oh. Clearly not. Clearly not. History has demonstrated that the Bible has served a lot of women well. They've taken a lot of strength and resource from the Bible. They have found moments in the Bible that validate and vindicate and strengthen themselves, their sense of themselves as women. And of course, a lot of women have suffered enormously from other parts of the Bible that say things about women. So it doesn't make it accessible. It doesn't make it inaccessible. And I think women who have been, brought up in Christian households have probably made the best of their circumstances and the best that the Bible can offer them. But for me, it is not a sacred document upon which I would base my values, my aspirations, how I want to bring up my children, etc., etc. That do?
I think the ultimate question is, What I'm suggesting is that God is knowable by the individual. In the New Testament it says, in God there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free person. That's irrelevant to God when it becomes the individual. Authentic Christianity, which I would distinguish from all the baggage tradition has saddled it with. But authentic Christianity, the very essence, is a personal relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. That would be authentic, and it's a personal, I want to stress the personal relationship with God. So at the end of the day, it really is how you as an individual will respond to the personal calls that God may put within you.
This question is to Dr. Durston. What is the difference between belief in a God versus belief in the Bible and Jesus Christ?
Well, I'm not... Belief in a God, the term God is quite a general category for many people. For many people it's vague, undefined. I believe there's an historical argument for the existence of God, and that is something I sometimes present. And it centers around the idea that Jesus of Nazareth actually claimed to be God. He says, before Abraham was born, I am. He used God's memorial name. Now, anybody can claim to be God. If we're polite, we shouldn't laugh at people who claim to be God. We can just ask them, what warrant have we got to take what they're telling is true? What warrant have we to believe that what they're saying might be true? In the case of Jesus of Nazareth, there are ancient messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. And you can begin with the Old Testament assumption. You can assume it's just myths and fairy tales, okay, just to be safe. Myths and fairy tales, but the myths and fairy tales that you're assuming make very specific predictions about this messianic figure. Two major events in history, that the first time he comes, he would pay the demands for justice for all of humanity. The second time he comes as none other than God himself at Armageddon at the end of history. So for these reasons, these ancient prophecies, that Old Testament sets itself up for possible falsification if those prophecies never came true, but they did. The first set have all come true. So I tend to say that God has revealed himself through Jesus Christ primarily, and the credibility of Jesus Christ centers on his fulfillment of the ancient prophecies, and it seems that there's some historical evidence for his resurrection from the dead. So I would have to say that belief in the Bible in general and belief in God and Jesus Christ are all interlaced. Now, that raises a whole host of questions, but I just simply don't have time to address them.
Repeat the question. You've lost it?
There's a lot of...
There's a difference between belief in God and...
Yes. What's the, to paraphrase it poorly, what is the distinction between belief in God and belief in the Bible and Jesus Christ?
Well, it seems a fairly obvious one, because there's lots of people in the world that believe in God and don't believe in that Jesus is the Son of God. They don't know the Bible. They don't want to know the Bible. They have their own stories about this God. So I don't see why the God has to be the God of Christians. It could be any kind of God, I guess.
This is addressed to either debater, but we're going to address it to Dr. Finn. What is the appeal to finding the existence of God, and how does that make a difference in today's world?
What is the appeal of?
Of finding the existence of God, and how does that make a difference in today's world?
The appeal of finding the existence of God? What is the appeal of believing in God? Endless appeal, I would think. it's kind of nice to think that there might be someone other than your immediate family and friends and community that is actually looking out for you, that might love you in this perfect love, that might have a heavenly spot waiting for you, that actually pays attention to you in every detail and knows that you're trying hard and being good and you don't deserve the suffering you've got and might have compensation for it. I can see all kinds of good reasons for believing, or motivations for believing in God, and even wanting to believe in God. Those are some of them. Another one might be that you actually find the values and ends that contemporary life offers you as worth living for inadequate. They just don't give you a good enough reason for living. 1 minute. They're shallow. They're individualistic and atomizing. They don't offer you any aspiration besides fame, fortune, and money. And I can see that stories about God and spiritual aspiration can have some appeal. And actually these are the sorts of things I think that the scientific atheists don't pay any attention to. And that therefore in some way they miss the point when they are attempting to critique theism. So I do think that people have they're fairly sound motives in this barren world for wanting a God to exist.
I think there are massive philosophical implications if God does exist, and therefore it's well worth considering this, if God does. I just jotted down a few things. How does the existence of God make a difference today in the 21st century? First of all, I would say that we now have a grounds for morality, ethics, justice, and so forth that actually transcend civilizations. So we can actually look at a particular society and say, what you're doing over there is wrong, on the basis of something that is higher still. So that our moral perceptions, our moral intuitions actually have a basis. That another thing it does is that those things we have sensed in nature are true. There is something supernatural woven into nature. God's invisible attributes, eternal power and divine nature. We might not just be a bag of meat after all. There might be a point to life. If the universe has been designed for life, and has been designed by a supernatural entity who has purpose and meaning for us, maybe there's something much more. I already got the stop sign here. I got to sit down halfway through the room.
So a question for Dr. Durston. Suppose you know for a fact, or found out for a fact, that there is no heaven and hell or afterlife. Would you believe or worship God still, and why?
I'm always interested in the truth. I define the truth as, I take the correspondence theory of truth, that a belief is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. So I'm more interested in what reality says rather than what I believe. What I'm interested in is conforming my beliefs to reality. And so if whatever way reality is, that's the way I want to go. But I have to say that my experience of reality is that there's not just, I like this point that Dr. Finn raised about this idea that we want to be able to know what nature is. I suspect we know a lot less about nature than what we think we do. That film, The Matrix, that first one, watch that. I'm not saying we're living in the Matrix, but I suspect sometimes that reality is not at all what we think it is. Now, what did I get off on that for? What was that? Oh, heaven and hell. What if it did not exist? Oh, yeah. So my experience is that it seems self-evident that we have something within us. We have a soul, and we spend so much of our lives trying to convince ourselves that we're wrong about what we sense about ourselves, that we don't have a soul, that we're just a bag of meat. An intelligent bag of meat, but that's all we are. We try and convince ourselves, but my perception of reality is that I'm acknowledging what's self-evident to me, and that I do have a soul. There is a supernatural reality out there. And my personal experience of God is by far the most fulfilling thing I've ever experienced. And I haven't lived a deprived life. I have experienced a lot of fun things. But nothing compares to knowing the one who is the beauty personified, love and honor personified, justice. Nothing compares to that, and feeling that that being cares about me, actually loves me. Now, of course, I said I could be insane, could be spinning a yarn here. You have to make your decision on that.
Two quick comments on the last speaker before I forget them. In this response and the previous response, he set up a false dichotomy between believing in God and being nothing but a bag of meat, right? It's either God gives you value or the only value you have is a bag of meat. This is just not true to your own experience. I am sure your parents cared for you. I am sure there are other people who care about you. I'm sure there's lots of other ways that you have value. If you abandon God, you are not stuck with being a bag of meat. First false dichotomy. The second thing is that this is you've talked several times about what is real. You said something, what if there is a difference between the traditional representations of God, and the real thing, the real spiritual truth? Well, my argument about the space between is, or even the whole logic of identity, is I'm actually disputing this presupposition of a real thing, independent of our access to it, independent of any language or categories we have for conceptualizing it. The end.
This question is for Dr. Finn. The majority of the arguments made were based on the Christian point of view. However, would the same logic apply from different religious points of view? So if we could address the theistic.
I actually I do think my comments do apply to other monotheisms in as much as I know anything about them. But I'd be interested to know if some of the things I did say were exclusively relevant only to Christian theism. I didn't think they were. But certainly the nouveau atheists, for the most part, well, no, they don't. They take on all the monotheisms. So no, I do think it's relevant to other religious traditions. Although we have to be careful of what we push into the ragbag category of religion. So they're bound to be. So I would restrict it to the truths of monotheisms.
I would say my first argument would apply to there are various religions that claim to believe in some sort of a God, a creator, invisible creator, non-physical creator of the universe, and if that's their concept of God, then my first argument would also apply to that. That first argument is merely step one. It establishes the existence of the supernatural. My second argument is that people can actually experience God. I don't think of that in terms of applying to various world religions. I think of that in terms as applying to every individual. So there I take a step away from religion and take a step towards the individual now. That applies to the individual. Now, where Christianity comes in my experience is I heard the call of God, and I still feel the call of God. I still feel the presence of God. But that experience began the night I asked Jesus Christ to come into my life, take away the culpability for all the things that I've done wrong, satisfy the demands of justice, if you will, so that he could then satisfy the demands of love for me. At that night, when I finally made that decision, I sensed I'd opened a door that I have walked through now and lived through for decades now, and I'd have to say my experience of God began at that point. So that aspect of things converges on Christianity.
This question is for Dr. Durston. Many religions deny the existence of dinosaurs, even though there is physical proof of their existence. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, obviously dinosaurs existed. You have to conform your beliefs to reality. A belief is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. The reality out there, as best as we can see, is that there were dinosaurs. Therefore, a true belief will be there were dinosaurs existed.
Quite frankly, my dear Charlotte, I don't give a damn.
Questions for Dr. Finn. Do you think the universe with such complexity and order could have occurred and sustained without supernatural creation?
Well, obviously I do, since I'm an atheist. But this doesn't mean to say that I am not inspired and overawed by this universe that is so complex and dynamic and full of rich detail and alarming realities. I mean, to me, it's just like gobsmacking. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And that gives me sufficient sense of awe and beauty and wonder. I don't need to find some transcendent origin that would explain it all. So the kind of mystery and awe and wonder that people project onto God, I experience it even looking at weeds, quite frankly. Yes, I don't think it needs a godly explanation.
A God of the gaps argument occurs when somebody says, wow, that's impressive. We don't know what did that, therefore God must have. That's not what I've offered here tonight. So the complexity of the universe is truly awesome. The problem is that when God, my first argument was not a God of the gaps argument. What I did is I showed that it's logically entailed that you have to have a supernatural origin for nature itself. Once you got nature up and running, for example, the oldest book in the Bible that's thought is the book of Job, and God's talking to Job and showing him how little he really, in such a poor position of knowledge that he's in. And one of the things he mentions is, does he understand the laws of nature that govern the universe? Fascinating concept for the oldest book in the Bible. The moment you have laws of nature, you have science. So I see science as our tool to try and understand how the universe works, how nature works. And so there's always, once you get in the universe and seeing how it operates, then you can use science. But science is founded on nature, on logic, and at that point, that's where you have to look at, did nature have a beginning? If it had a beginning, it cannot possibly have a natural cause.
For Dr. Durston, if morality is transcendental, why do people in certain areas of the world believe execution is okay, whereas people in Canada generally do not?
We all seem to have moral, well, most of us have moral intuitions, but humanity, we all have our own, we're all different as individuals, and we will tend to rationalize, we are influenced by our neighbors, we're persuaded otherwise, and we live year after year in a society that has an enormous amount of influence on us, and we're part of that society. And so it is the case that you will have disagreement. We seem to have a fundamental awareness that some things are good and bad, but we disagree on the details of what's good and bad. So my argument doesn't really contingent on that we all agree that this particular item A, proposition A, is good. That's not what I'm arguing here. I'm going deeper than that. I'm saying we have this intuition that we have a basis for these discussions, that we seem to have an intuitive awareness that there's a way we ought to live. The problem is, how do we actually put that down? C.S. Lewis addresses this a little bit and says that sometimes if you look at disagreements on moral principles, they're disagreeing on details, but when you look at the fundamental principle they hold in common, they agree on those fundamental principles. And so it's a very complicated situation, but my argument hinges on that we actually can have this concept of right and wrong not on that we all agree on the details of it. Nevertheless, I think there is surprising agreement on major things within morality and ethics. The details of whether to execute a murder or not kind of hinges on other factors, which the value of human life, whether is that going to deter other people, is there some sort of retribution that's required here? There are a host of things. Can we rehabilitate that person? I just read there was some fellow who has just been sentenced to life and he's eligible for parole in 4 years for stabbing his girlfriend and killing her. He stabbed her 104 times. And in 4 years he's eligible for, now I would hope he's not going to get parole, but it does suggest how you put a value on something by what you're willing to pay for it, or what the cost is.
Obviously, I don't think there is a supernatural moral law. I don't think there is a supernatural ground for ethics. I don't think we should ask for one either. I make a distinction between morality and ethics. Morality is like the mores of our community. It's the habits, it's the values, it's the practices and behaviors that we are born into and that to some extent we consent to live with. But the ethical moment is every time you have to choose whether you're going to conform to that moral principle or not, or whether this moral principle in itself is something that needs to be got rid of. So if you might have executions in one community for certain kinds of crimes, and this may be quite consistent with the religion as well as the cultural laws of the community, you still have that possibility of questioning it. And that's the space of that's the space between the language and the reality. That's the space of not knowing where you actually have an ethical choice to make. So you can choose to conform to the morality of your community. You can conform to consent to the practices of execution, or you may choose to resist that, and that can be true all down the line.
This question is for both of you. Why do we want there to be an external God, as no other species wants or needs a personal relationship with an external God?
It seems a little bit like a question I've already addressed. Why do we want an external God? And then part of the question was, since no other species seems to want that, I don't know how we can make those claims about the other species. I mean, if they did, how would they communicate it to us? Perhaps if we did observe the birds, they're twittering away to their bird god. I don't think I have anything to, well, there's probably a lot to add about why, did you say why we want a personal God, was that it? Or just a transcendent God? A relationship. I think I'd just be repeating what I already said. I think there's a lot of good reasons for wanting like a big daddy in the sky or a big mummy that is all embracing and always available and always caring for us, and that we can actually appeal to, at least personally, to help us out with our ethical decisions about how to live with the morality of our community. So I can understand the appeal, and I think I've said that before. So.
Why do we want there to be a God? My suggestion is that we've been built for having a relationship with God, and so it's built right into us that we want this. I want food, I want oxygen, I want water. There was a time in my life, in my teenage years, I was very restless. I wanted a soulmate to share my life with. I wanted a kindred spirit. And one day, I saw her. And we've been married for 32 years. But that restlessness within me actually drove me, or brought me to the point, or somehow was influential in my life in finding that soulmate, that kindred spirit. And I suggest that the restlessness within us, that goes much deeper than that on the level of our soul, has actually been built within us. And so we either have to pursue that or try and convince ourselves it's just our imagination. We don't really have a soul. There really is no God. This belief is just a primitive thing. That's your choice.
Okay, so as we just hit 30 minutes, I'm going to close up the question and answer. I'd like to apologize to anyone whose question wasn't asked, but as you may see if you're close enough to our desk, we sort of got swarmed with a lot of them, so the filtering process was rather rapid and frantic. But now we'll move back to closing arguments from each of the speakers, starting down with Dr. Durston.
Well, I'll just respond to a few things that Dr. Finn has raised that I think are particularly interesting, and then maybe close with a 1-minute final comment, so keep those fingers going. Let me know, give me advance warning. Bag of meat. Is it a false dichotomy? Parents loved you. People value you. My mother-in-law needs constant 24-around-the-clock care. I am often in her nursing home where she gets that. And I see people there who have outlived their family, or they never had a family, have outlived all their friends. There is nobody left to care for them. So if value is contingent on other people caring for you, what happens when the last person who cares for you dies? Do you then become valueless? I don't think so. I think your value is more than just based on what other human beings how they're caring for you. There's something more that gives you value than merely other subjective human opinions. There are some people who have no friends. There are many people in this world who are alone tonight just trying to find enough food to survive another day. Nobody knows them. They're out scrabbling in some bush somewhere in a third world country on the end of their rope. We don't know their names. Nobody else knows their names. Their friends and brothers and sisters are long gone. They died of starvation weeks or months ago. Not a soul in this world knows their name, but I'm suggesting that God does. Sorry, and that's what gives us value. Sorry, get emotional sometimes about this. Another interesting thing Dr. Finn says is no supernatural ground for ethics as the practices of society, but it's a principle that but we can decide whether it's a principle that needs to be gotten rid of. Now that's fascinating. What is it that you're looking at that tells you this principle in my society needs to be gotten rid of? Once again, we're back to a higher moral code than what emerges in our society, so that we actually feel that there are practices in our society that we can speak against, we can work against. But it's on the basis, I'm suggesting to you, of a higher moral code. Yes, we can make up our own, society can make up our own, and so forth. How many minutes I got left here?
2 and 20 seconds.
What'd you say?
20 seconds.
2 and 20 seconds. Well, let me just close by making something up. If I was participating in this debate tonight to win a debate, I'd use debate tricks, I'd use debate strategies, I would use arguments that I've used for years that are easy to defend. But that's not the objective, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think it's Dr. Finn's objective here tonight is to win a debate. My objective is to urge you to seriously think about these things. That perhaps self-awareness you once had as a child, that maybe you do have a soul, maybe there is a God, maybe He has been calling you, maybe it's real. I know there's people here tonight that have worked hard to convince themselves it isn't, but I want to urge you to take that and give that a second thought. And of course, as a Christian, I found that relationship with God by putting my faith in Jesus as the one who came to satisfy the demands of justice so that He could satisfy the demands of perfect love. Now, of course, you're going to have to decide whether you think that's true or not. But for me, that made all the difference between the time in my life when I felt I wanted that relationship with God, but I was afraid of God. He seemed infinitely far away, and I had none. I felt detached from whatever it is out there, from God. I felt detached from God, but the thing that made the difference was the night I put my faith in Christ. So I urge you to seriously think about this at least, and that has been my objective this evening. Think about these things. maybe talk with other people about these things.
For closing comments, Dr. Finn, you have 5 minutes as well.
Yes. I was at a loss what to say for these closing comments. So I thought I would tell you about the philosopher Iris Murdoch. Just came to me to do this. Actually teaching one of her novels with my first year class, but I'm sure there are none of them here, because we have the class at 8:30 tomorrow. Hi. And I'm giving away the punchline too, so they were supposed to be working all this out. Okay, Iris Murdoch has a philosophy of morality. She has an article called The Sovereignty of Good. And she makes a case in her philosophy for an intimate relationship between goodness, truth, and beauty, which in a way is perhaps what we all want. Now, for her, the good person is the one who pays close attention to the particularity of the reality in front of them. Not to transcendences that live in some supernatural realm, not to abstractions, not to principles you may have learned, not to sacred texts, but that you pay attention to the particular reality in which you are engaged, right? Now, this is a lot more difficult than you think, this idea of paying attention. She picked up the idea of attention from Simone Weil, who some of you may know of, who was religiously motivated. Iris Murdoch is not, although she did call herself a Quaker, and Quakers profess not to have a God, but to appeal to the God in each person, which you could just translate as the best part, the goodness, the beauty, the love, the aspiration, and all the rest of it. So for Iris Murdoch, to be a good person is to pay attention to the reality in front of you. This is not as easy as you think, because we all kind of wear our access to reality is veiled by a screen of what she calls the fat, relentless ego. So our own interests, desires, preoccupations, fears, anxieties get in the way of us seeing what is in front of us. And so we are prejudiced. We'll see what we want to see what we expect to see, we'll act on old habits and traditions. And then how this gets to beauty is that she says that a good person is good in the same way a good artist is good. And that's because what a good artist does is pay attention to the reality in front of them and do their best to express it in whatever way they do. And the bad artist is the one who lapses into fantasy and allows the fat, relentless ego to get in the way. So paying attention to reality is also kind of working on yourself, right? And she says that, she also talks about the perfection of the good, and she says that we all know we never actually accomplish. If we're wanting to be good, we don't ever accomplish it. We all fall short of it. If we want to be a good artist, we don't accomplish it, we fall short of it. And that's what keeps us going on, trying to be a better artist, practicing our music more, practicing our singing more, reading more silly philosophy books, trying to write better, you know, etc., etc. So I just present that to you because I do think that it's a vision of goodness, truth, and beauty that's linked to reality, knowing a reality. It doesn't require any kind of aspiration or affirmation of some supernatural being. And it's something that's available to all of us, and all of us may well have witnessed. She asks us in her novels, she asks us to imagine people, the degrees to which people try and do this, and of course we all fail. And that's fine, I don't need to say any more. That will do.